how much mana does a Yu-Gi-Oh combo cost? And maybe more importantly, why do we care? Because they're completely different games. Their resource systems are completely different. So what's the point of even doing a video like this? Well, I want to kind of dispel any kind of concerns early on. The purpose of this video is not to demonstrate that one system is superior to the other or something like that. This is not some elaborate trick where I use the comparisons to set up an explanation why you clearly have to support one game over the other. That's not the intention. Honestly, this is mostly a for fun thing, something where I think that we can use this example to potentially try to contextualize why the resource systems feel so different, and by extension, why the games feel so different. Obviously, with a game like Yu-Gi-Oh, it has been really defined in the modern era in particular by speed, but what does that speed really look like? And I think for players of other games who don't necessarily have the context of what the kinds of effects in Yu-Gi-Oh are, putting them into the terms of Magic might help. In the same way, I think that doing this might help Yu-Gi-Oh players understand why, from other game contexts, Yu-Gi-Oh looks so bananas, why people feel like the effects in Yu-Gi-Oh look so powerful and swingy, because when we contextualize it as, okay, on your first turn, you're spending the amount of resources that maybe I spend in 10 turns or more. Well, who knows? You'll have to see just how many resources I end up spending in this combo. I think that that is something that could also prove to be pretty interesting. So let's set some ground rules and I'll kind of explain the methodology of how I did this. And then you can walk through with me as I describe each individual step of the combo and the comparisons that I would make. So I am playing a Lunalight deck in this game. It's just one of the decks that I've been playing more recently, especially in the wake of my beloved Mitsurugi tanking a couple of bans on Master Duel. So it was a deck that I had some replays hanging around for, and I figured that was a good place to start. I am going to try to be as stingy as possible with these mana costs. So obviously, in the instances where an effect on a Yu-Gi-Oh card has a direct one-to-one effect in Magic, we'll use the direct one-to-one effect where possible. However, the machinations of the games are different. There are going to be different restrictions. Magic, for example, doesn't have the concept of locks or type exclusive targeting in the same way that Yu-Gi-Oh tends to have. So in some instances, we'll have to do some finagling in that regard. And in some instances, cards are going to just be so different that we're going to have to create custom Magic cards essentially to represent the Yu-Gi-Oh cards that we're trying to evaluate. In those instances, I'm going to use the cheapest example of an effect that I can find. So a good example of this might be something like if there was an effect that dealt 3 damage, or if we scaled it up from 3 damage in Magic to 3 damage in Yu-Gi-Oh, which is something along the lines of 2100, I guess. In Magic, there are cards that cost 2 mana that deal 3 damage, like Searing Spear, but there's also one that costs 1 mana in Lightning Bolt, and I would use the 1 mana example. That's just a really, really bare bones, simple example. It'll come up. So if I ever miss something and you see an effect that you think could be cheaper, let me know in the comments, because that's the kind of design goal we're looking for here. Ideally, we're trying to make this combo as cheaply as possible. If at any point in the combo you also feel like I have created a custom card that is just fundamentally unfair in the sense that I have not assigned fair costs to the effects, I'd love to hear that as well, because obviously in some cases here I am having to kind of create things from not that many examples, and so I'm kind of spitballing on the mana values. So let's get into it. We'll check it out. I'll give you the replay. We'll cut back and forth between me and the replay. I'll try to make sure that you understand what's going on, whether you're a Magic player or whether you're a Yu-Gi-Oh player. I'll try and keep you in context for both. And we'll see just how much mana it costs to do a kind of standard Yu-Gi-Oh combo. Okay, so the game starts, and it's kind of a classic start to a Yu-Gi-Oh game. I have Fire Formation Tenki. My opponent goes for Maxi, and then I'm able to negate the Maxi with Crossout Designator. So let's start with the crossout just because it's resolving in the chain first. This is a bit weird when we want to describe it in a Magic context. Basically, what's going on here is that Maxi is being activated from hand, and then I'm negating the activation. And I think in the Magic context, we would call this negating an activation as opposed to countering a spell, because it's not as though my opponent actually like put the Maxi in place somehow. It literally just discarded to create an effect immediately on the stack or chain. So in this case, while you could technically go for a counterspell of some sort, I think I'm going to go with Stifle, just in the interest of keeping it as cheap as possible. So 1 converted mana cost, 1 blue mana is where we're at currently on the tracker. But then obviously, after that resolves, we have to finish with the Fire Formation Tenki. This one is a little bit weird because this is searching for a monster of level 4 or less, and it has a specific type. It does mean that we can't use a really generic creature tutor in the Magic context. I was initially just going to use Eladamri's Call, which is two CMC and is green white, but I think that is a little too good, and it's not quite exactly the right or most fair cost. So instead, I think the more apt comparison is with both Recruiter of the Guard and Imperial Recruiter. These are 2 creatures that get to search for creatures with power or toughness 2 or less. It's not level, but I think it's about as close as we're going to get in terms of finding a comparison in the Magic environment. And I think that it is also an appropriate cost. So we'll go with 3 CMC and a white, I guess, just for the sake of argument, leaving our totals at the end of the first chain in this game at 4 CMC, 1 blue, and 1 white. Okay, next we have 2 more game actions. So the Fire Formation Tenki finds Lunalight Gold Leo, which then I'm able to play, and mercifully it doesn't get negated. A fun fact, I think I would have lost the game on the spot if it does, but Lunalight Gold Leo does not get negated, and it goes and searches for a Lunalight Yellow Marten, and then I discard the Yellow Marten and get the Yellow Marten effect. So let's do these cards one at a time. First things first, Lunalight Gold Leo. This is a card that we really need to build a custom card for. There's not even something that we can find that is close to this effect, but it is, I think, something that we can build with 2 different cards. So conveniently, quite recently, there was a card printed into Magic the Gathering called Formidable Speaker. This card, when it enters, allows you to discard a card and then search for a creature, which is, I think, as close as we're going to get in the Magic context to the text of Gold Leo. Gold Leo, of course, lets you search for a Lunalight monster and then discard a card from your hand. So it's the other way around. But in Magic, although there is the concept of discarding as part of cost, there's not typically much in the way of examples of discarding as in part of the resolution of a tutor ability. There's looting where you can draw and then discard, but there's not a whole lot of tutor and then discard. So we'll go with Formidable Speaker. It does flip the order of the discard, but it's pretty close to the same type of ability. But that doesn't capture both halves of Lunalight Gold Leo's ability. The other half is that when you discard a Lunalight monster, you're able to return it to your hand on a once per turn. So once per turns are fine. We can just template our custom card to say once per turn, but there isn't, as far as I could tell, an example of a card that does this for completely free. There are some cards like Athreos, which ask your opponent whether or not they want to pay 3 life to allow you to return a creature, but we're not going to go with anything like that. So we're just going to build this card as a custom card with the simplest version of this effect as we can find, which is Raise Dead. This is just a single black mana, and it allows you to return a creature from the graveyard to your hand. So our custom Lunalight Gold Leo costs 3 converted mana to play. It's 2 and a green, and then we're gonna imagine that it has an activated ability for a black that lets you get a creature back from the graveyard after you discard. And then the Yellow Marten is a interesting problem to solve because we don't have a ton of examples in Magic the Gathering of cards that have an effect when they are discarded where you don't need to pay a cost. You do just always still typically need to pay a cost. There are a few examples, but we do have a mechanic that cares about cards being discarded, which is Madness. So I've kind of templated Lunalight Yellow Martin as my in this custom card example as being a creature that has a madness effect that, you know, when you cast it for its madness effect, you get this ability. Obviously, it doesn't. The one difference in the Magic context is that would put the creature in play, and obviously that doesn't happen here. But if we're looking for the ability to search for something, it gets a little bit weird because how do you define a spell trap in the Magic context, right? Like continuous spells feel a bit like enchantments and artifacts, whereas the like quick play spells feel more like instants, normal spells feel like sorcery. So how exactly do you do that templating? What I ended up settling on is just saying, well, all of the various tutors for these types of cards cost the same, and so we'll just go with one of those. In my case, I tutored for a Lunalight Masquerade, and so we'll call that a sorcery. It could be an enchantment as well. I would hear arguments for it being an enchantment very happily. But either way, we're going to say that costs 2 and a blue or a white, your choice. I'm going to say a blue. The comparisons are things like Solve the Equation, Idyllic Tutor, Fabricate. We have lots of examples of these types of cards, so it's a pretty easy comparison to make. So what that means is that after Lunalight Gold Leo, Trigger, and Yellow Martin casting for madness, quote unquote, we are sitting at a total of 11 converted mana cost, and we've spent 1 black mana, 1 green mana, 1 white mana, and a blue mana. 2 blue mana even, depending on how you wanted to pay for your 3 mana search for a thing. Okay, so next up, I activate Lunalight Masquerade, and I take a copy of Lunalight Silverhound and put it into my graveyard from my library or my deck, because we're playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And then I'm able to use that to search for a Kaleido Chick for free. And then lastly, I use the Kaleido Chick effect to search for a Lunalight Black Sheep and return it with the Gold Leo effect. So we'll go do these one at a time. Most of them are, well, none of them are actually all that easy. So let's start with the Masquerade effect. It's a little bit weird because you're taking specifically a creature or a monster, in this case, from your deck and putting it into the graveyard. And then you also have this second ability to get back a polymerization at some later point when you successfully cast one. So we have to fold both of those effects into how we value the card. So in terms of the putting a creature from your deck into your graveyard, I think we can pretty comfortably value that at 1 mana and 1 black mana in particular. Yes, Entomb is technically templated such that you can put any card into your graveyard from your deck, which is the most obvious Magic comparison. But then also, it's kind of, you can think of it as 1/3 of a Buried Alive. Buried Alive is 2 and a black, and it lets you put 3 creatures from your library into your graveyard. And so I think we can pretty comfortably value that effect at 1 black. But there's also the effect to get back the polymerization. In the Magic context, the best example I could come up with for this that felt fair was Flood of Recollection. This is blue for a sorcery that returns an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to hand, which I think is the best comparison, which means the total for Lunalight Masquerade is 3 mana, and it costs black, blue, all things considered. Technically, we're not using the ability till later, but we're going to fold it into the cost calculation now for simplicity's sake. Lunalight Silverhound is where things start to get really weird. This is a key distinction between games like Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! Up until this point, I've been able to build effects that have felt relatively fair and relatively like in line with effects that you would see in both games. But having a card that, when it is discarded, just puts a creature in play, or in this case, a monster in play, even with restrictions, it was really challenging to find a Magic comparison for this that felt fair. I think we're going to have to use that same templating of we're going to pretend that this card has madness or something so that when it is discarded, you can pay a cost in order to get a specific effect. And in order to get up to a card that lets you search for anything in your deck and play it, there are a couple of comparisons. But for cost reasons, I think we need to work out the one that feels the most fair. So, natural order is the cheapest way that you can take one creature and turn it into any green creature in your deck. Now, granted, this also has a restriction to Lunalight, so I think that it being restricted to one color is fine. The problem is natural order very clearly has a secondary cost of sacrificing a creature, and this is going to come up later as to why this card is challenging for templating reasons. As a result, I think the best example I can come up with for a card that just generically says get anything and put it into play is something like Tooth and Nail. You could technically go with like Green Sun Zenith or Finale of Devastation, which are X costs, but because you don't always know what X is going to be, and you can't, like, I think for the sake of this exercise, assume that. I think we have to go with something like Tooth and Nail instead. And Tooth and Nail does, in fact, when entwined, cost 9. It goes and gets 2 creatures, though, and puts them both into play. So I think we can knock off some amount of costs from our, like, hypothetical situation here and put it down to 7. But I do think that that's the best card comparison we have. So we'll add that to the stack as well, and into our calculation. Next, we have Kaleido Chick. This one is free. We got to put it into play for free, so we're not going to count any costs. I think if you had to hardcast this card in a Magic context, it would cost like something along the lines of like 4 and a black, 3 and a black. Like being able to put a creature from your graveyard or from your library into the graveyard, very powerful in both games. So I do think that that's something that would be costed kind of aggressively. But in this case, we don't have to worry about how much it costs because we got it for free with the Silverhound. Next, we have the Goldleo effect, which is the 1 black mana to bring back the Black Sheep that we discarded. This is obviously being accounted for already up top. That's how I'm doing all of the additional costs, but worth noting that it happens here. And then lastly, we have Lunalight Black Sheep, and we will talk about how that one works in a moment. So before we activate the Lunalight Black Sheep, we are sitting at a total of 21 converted mana cost and 2 black, 3 green, a white, and 4 blue so far in terms of our mana costs. And now we have to figure out the most reasonable way to template this Lunalight Black Sheep ability. It's a bit confusing because Lunalight Black Sheep is something where you get to discard it and then you get one of 2 effects. You can either regrow a Lunalight monster from your graveyard or banishment, or you can go search for a polymerization. I'm using the second ability in this context, so we're going to cost it according to that second ability. Up until, well, sort of true, but up until somewhat recently, there were not a ton of examples of Magic cards where you got to pay a cost and just discard the card to get an effect. However, in the original Kamigawa block, there was a little used mechanic called Channel, which did do this. You got to pay a cost, discard the card, get an effect. And then in the more recent Kamigawa block, Kamigawa Neon Dynasties, we went back to the channel mechanic. So now there's a lot more examples for how that ability might be templated. So what we've got here is we're going to have to pretend that Lunalight Black Sheep has channel, and then we need to come up with the cost that feels appropriate for search for polymerization, which I think in the Magic context, we're going to call it an instant or sorcery. That seems the most fair. So previously, I talked about solve the equation with Lunalight Yellow Martin, and I think we're going to come back to it here. It's the most obvious comparison. But one thing about channel effects, they tend to be slightly more expensive than the quote-unquote going rate for playing that card. And so as a result, I think what we're going to say is that instead of paying 3 for solve the equation, we're going to pay 4 because we're going to have channeled Lunalight Black Sheep to get the same kind of solve the equation effect to put the polymerization in our hand. That means that we're going to have paid 4 CMC. There's going to be a blue pip involved. It's going to bring our total cost to 25 converted mana cost, 2 black, 3 green, a white, and at this point we're moving up to 5 blue. Okay, so I always knew this was going to be the part of the process that was going to be the most complicated. Polymerization fusion summons a monster. And while there are some Yu-Gi-Oh! Special summoning types that have reasonable parallels in the Magic context, this is not one of them. So unlike things like maybe like synchro summoning or ritual summoning, where we could have come up with reasonable kind of machinations for how these things would work, because there would at least be the concept of like adding converted mana cost, or potentially in the case of ritual summoning, you know, like I mentioned previously with a card like Natural Order, that actually lines up pretty cleanly with what we would expect from a ritual summoning effect. Unfortunately, fusion summoning is not one of those two types. So what are we going to do? How do we build this effect? I spent quite a long time looking for effects in Magic that let you sacrifice or discard cards in order to summon something from your deck, in order to play something from your deck. And I was about to give up when I came across Modern Horizons 3 Uncommon, The Hunger Tide Rises. So this is a saga, which means that for my Yu-Gi-Oh viewers, this is a card where every turn you get a new effect, basically, from the card. And in this case, the first 3 chapters of the saga just make a 1/1, but then chapter 4 lets you sacrifice any number of creatures. You search your library or graveyard for a creature card with mana value less than or equal to the number of creatures sacrificed this way, and you put it onto the battlefield. So it's not perfect, but it's one of the only cards I could find that cared about number of creatures used, which is the summoning condition for most fusion summoned monsters that we're looking for in this case, right? So in the Lunalight context, what I'm about to polymerize for in this case is obviously Lunalight Perfume Dancer, and Perfume Dancer requires 2 Lunalight monsters. Later on down the line, as if you know how this combo works and what this deck is trying to do in the end, I'm going to be fusion summoning a Lunalight Liger Dancer, which is going to take 4 monsters. But anyway, all this to say, the Hunger Tide Rises, I actually think is a totally fair comparison. It's as close as we're going to get taking the Magic effect and putting it into a Yu-Gi-Oh context. I think there is a question of how do we price it, because it's the 4th chapter of a saga. Like technically you have to wait a number of turns before you're able to do this. I've decided that I'm just not going to engage with the fact that it's chapter 4 of a saga for now. For the sake of argument in this context, I think we can assign this effect the cost of 2 and a green relatively safely, although I would be totally willing to hear out why that's wrong. There is the other element too of obviously sacrificing 2 monsters in order to get a Perfume Dancer versus sacrificing 2 creatures to get a 2-drop in the Magic context feels very different. But I think that because we don't have access to a better, more analogous effect, this is, I think, as good as we're going to do. We can also kind of imagine that we're getting a similar effect to something like, say, like Eldritch Evolution or Neoform, where you're upgrading maybe along mana cost lines as well. In that case, you get to get something that is 1 cost higher. In this case, we could even imagine that we're combining these 2 effects together, and you're sacrificing your 2 4 cost Lunalight monsters, as we've established, to go get an 8 cost one. You know, maybe that's a comparison we would make as well. But I think for this, we're going to say that it costs 2 and a green, which brings us up to a total of 28 converted mana cost, 2 black, 4 green, a white, and 5 blue. And then we put into play Lunalight Perfume Dancer. Importantly, this one is free, which is good because I think pricing this one would be a nightmare. There are two effects on the Perfume Dancer. There is the effect to go find the perfume, which unfortunately I have both in my hand already, so that doesn't do anything in this context. I think you would value that at something along 3 or 4 mana in a magic context. And then the second effect to return something to hand and then summon a monster from your hand is not something I could find a clean comparison for in the magic context. We have cards that can tap to put things into play, but obviously that's a little bit weird. I would value the ability of return something and then play something from your hand there at a very expensive rate in the magic context, because obviously we are gating the power of cards behind the amount of mana that you need to put into them, which means that just generically getting to put anything into play would need to be exceptionally expensive. I think something like Maelstrom Archangel is an interesting kind of comparison point to look at, so maybe something like that is where we're getting to. But yeah, fortunately, I didn't have to work out exactly how much Perfume Dancer would cost. Okay, so next we have the front half of Lunalight Perfume. This one's actually easier than most of the effects we've done today. This one, there is a really clean comparison. Magic players watching the video are likely screaming something like reanimate or animate dead, and I didn't decide to go with either of those effects because I don't think that that's entirely fair. They both have conditions. One of them is an enchantment, which in this case would be like an equip spell, and the other one does cost you life, and this importantly doesn't. It is just free. So I do think we have to go with the very traditional Zombify. This is just 4 converted mana cost. It is a 3 and a black spell that lets you return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, which is exactly what Perfume is doing here. Obviously, there is conditions here. You can only get a Lunalight, but I think that we don't have enough of those types of conditions in Magic for me to feel comfortable picking something like, say, like Unearth instead. So we're gonna go with Zombify here. So that brings us up to a sum total of 32 total mana, 3 black, 4 green, a white, and 5 blue. Okay, next I activate the Yellow Martin's ability from the graveyard. This is a challenging one for me to find a comparison for. There are not a lot of instances in Magic's history where we return permanents to hand as a result of playing something from the graveyard. There are cards that, as an additional cost to cast, will ask you to return cards from the battlefield to your hand. Those certainly exist. They're not tremendously common, but they do exist. And so I'm not saying that it's a non-existent ability, but it's not one that happens when you are returning something from the graveyard. We do have some instances of it actually happening for free, like for Cauldron Familiar, for example. You get to sacrifice a food and then immediately bring it back. And then there are a litany of examples of cheap black creatures that come back from the graveyard for a relatively nominal cost. And so that's what I'm going to go with here. I think that I would hear arguments that maybe this effect should be more expensive, but I'm going to go with just a single black mana as the cost for this effect. Dread Wanderer is the kind of standard here. This one does come back for a single black mana. It's mostly unconditional. So that's going to bring us up to a total CMC of 33, and we are at 4 black, I believe 4 green still, a white, and 5 blue. Okay, next we have the Lunalight Perfume from the graveyard activation. This one is kind of interesting as well. So you have to discard a card as part of the effect here, which means that you're basically turning 1 card into 1 Lunalight monster. There are a couple of defensible options here. We do have precedent in Magic the Gathering of turning creature in hand into creature from your deck. That's a thing that we do. It is typically stapled onto a permanent that's already had to be in play before you can do it, like Survival of the Fittest or Fauna Shaman, both of which cost 2 converted mana cost to get into play, but then for a single green can activate to generate that kind of effect. I don't think that means that I'm allowed to say this costs 1 mana. I think that this still has to be 3 mana, unfortunately. But I do think that it is just 3 mana. So we'll say it's 2 colorless and a green, which will bring us up to a total of 36 total mana, 4 black, 5 green, a white, and 5 blue. And we are going to tutor the Lunalight Tiger here, and this one gets confusing. Okay, so Lunalight Tiger is one of the harder cards to template, or at least I thought it was going to be going into it. There's a couple of elements that you need to capture with Tiger that are challenging to find in a Magic the Gathering context. Firstly, it is an effect that gets something back from the graveyard, but only temporarily, which while we have that kind of effect in Magic in something like, say, Goryo's Vengeance, or Shallow Grave, where the creature gets sacrificed at the end of turn, we don't typically have it on a whole lot of static effects, repeatable static effects. And I did think that that was important. There are some creatures that have the same effect as well, where you can play them, and then if you untap and sacrifice them, you can get a creature back from the graveyard and then use it to attack for 1 turn, and then it gets sacrificed. But this is something that needs to be repeatable. You need to be able to do it every turn, technically. Like my Lunalight Tiger, if I got another turn, could return another monster in this context. And so one of the cards I found early on in the process when I was looking was Geth, Thane of Contracts, which I thought was close. This costs 3 black and then 1 black and then 1 black to activate, so 6 total. But I felt like it being a creature didn't quite match with Lunalight Tiger, even though half the time Lunalight Tiger can technically be a monster. And then I also found a very old card, Strands of Night, that for 2 black gives you an enchantment that for black, 2 life, and sacrificing a swamp allows you to return a creature to the battlefield. This was arguably too good and had too low of a cost, so that one didn't work as well. But then I found classic and really a seminal card in my Magic playing experience, Whip of Erebos. This is from the original standard, original Theros block. This one costs 2 black to play, and then it has a 2 black activated ability that allows you to get a creature back a 1 time with haste. It also gets lifelink, but that's okay. And I think this is actually a pretty good comparison for Lunalight Tiger, all things considered. So that's going to bring us up to a total of 40 total mana, 6 black, 5 green, a white, and 5 blue. Okay, so we're starting to get to repeated effects, or ones that we have already talked about. So first things first, we activate Lunalight Tiger, so that's going to be our activation of Whip of Erebos, so that's 4 more mana. Then we get the Lunalight Perfume Dancer ability. I'm going to say this is free, that the cost of getting this ability on a card is rolled into the casting cost of the card. I would entertain that being wrong, but I'm going to do that here. Like I mentioned in the intro, this is not a perfect scientific method. And then we get to cast Polymerization again for the second time. Again, we're going to use the same comparison, Hunger Tide Rises. This time we are sacrificing 4 monsters or creatures, and we're going to get Lunalight Liger Dancer, which is obviously very exciting. So let's talk about Liger Dancer, and then we'll wrap up with where we are at with the costs. Liger Dancer, we're getting it for free. We're polymerizing it into play, so we don't have to deal with actually paying its cost. But what would this card cost if it was a Magic card in a hypothetical world? I do think that is an interesting conversation to have. So there's kind of 2 sides of the Liger Dancer effect that we need to evaluate. The first side is it's just a giant thing with protection. And this is a really easy comparison. I've actually heard a bunch of Yu-Gi-Oh players make this comparison before, that ones who have played Magic, which is that Liger Dancer feels a lot like Progenitus. This is a 10/10 that has protection from everything, very similar to Liger Dancer's templating, right down to the fact actually where, 10 damage is half your starting life total in Magic the Gathering, 3,800 attack points is close to half your starting life total in Yu-Gi-Oh. Obviously, Liger Dancer attacks twice. Let's not worry about that. There's not really a concept of attacking twice in Magic all that often. But then there's this second half of a card, which is the destroy all your opponent's special summoned monsters activated ability. And this is not something that gets put on Magic cards basically ever. This effect in old the old terminology is referred to as Plague Wind, which is a 9 mana sorcery that destroys all creatures you don't control, and they can't be regenerated. So that's 7 black. I think that that's honestly what you have to just look at. It is the most close comparison. There's In Garruk's Wake as well, technically, which destroys creatures and planeswalkers. But again, that still costs 9. So I think technically speaking, Liger Dancer costs something along the lines of 19 mana, uh, 2 of each color, and maybe 4 black, something like that. If we were going to template into a Magic card. Fortunately, we're not paying that cost. Although I do think it's interesting that if you look at the approximate mana values I have assigned to the various cards that are being used to polymerize into this, it does add up to close to 19, which is pretty cool. I think I'm a couple under, but it's close, which means that like from a mathematics standpoint, like you can kind of understand how the value of these effects maybe gets added together in order to make something this powerful. In order as to check in as to where we are in our final mana cost count, we've obviously cast Polymerization again, which we've described as the Hunger Tide Rises, which means we are at a sum total of 47 total mana, 8 black, 6 green, a white, and 5 blue. Okay, to close things off, we get the last couple of elements of the combo here. So first, we activate our Lunalight Perfume from the graveyard. This one we've discussed. It's like survival, Fauna Shaman. So we'll say like 2 and a green, something like that as the cost. And then we get to tutor for Lunalight Wolf, the other pendulum monster from this combo, or from this deck, sorry. This one is really weird to template, where I was able to find the Hunger Tide Rises for the polymerization effect. I don't think that that is an entirely appropriate comparison here for Lunalight Wolf. And the reason is that I don't know that you can say, like, obviously sacrificing from the battlefield, that one I think is pretty clear comparison. But in this case, we're actually like actively either sacrificing from the battlefield or getting rid of them from our graveyard. Now, in Magic, there is the concept of cards that are made cheaper by exiling cards from your graveyard. These are cards with delve, so like Gurmag Angler, Treasure Crew is probably the most iconic of the bunch. And I think we're going to have to build a custom card here in order to make this effect feel remotely reasonable. So if we take that effect, that custom effect I created for Silverhound, which allowed you to go get a creature from your deck, and I said it was kind of like tooth and nail, but a bit less, I think we can say the same thing here. I think we can say that maybe something along the lines of 7 is the right price for this effect to just be able to go get a creature and put it into play. However, we can also add the caveat of you can exile creatures from your graveyard in order to make this card cost, or they make this ability cost 1 less. And so ultimately, I think I'm going to settle on having Lunalight Wolf be a be a enchantment. I think is what it's going to have to be, that you can play for 2 and a green, and then probably you can activate for, we're going to say 5 and a black, but it's going to have delve. So the total cost on this total is going to be 4 mana, and it's going to be a green and a black, I think I said, which brings us up to a sum total for my first turn combo to put 2 Liger Dancers into play. The total mana cost is 54 total mana. You're going to have paid 9 black, 9 green, 1 white, and 5 blue. No red involved in Lunalight, apparently. So that's the combo. And, as you're now likely watching, I did manage to win this game, which is obviously very exciting. But now, let's cut to the end of the video, and I'll talk a little bit about why it was I wanted to do this comparison. Okay, to kind of sum up all of this, I guess we should start with the final conclusion, which was that, a relatively average Yu-Gi-Oh combo takes about 50 mana in Magic terms. And when you look at it in those numbers, I think that it is easy to get carried away and say, well, that seems crazy. I don't understand how that could be fun. And I think what I would say is, imagine if you were to take that number and just insert it into your game and ban the cards that you know are immediately problematic. And then ask yourself, like, would the game still be fun? Like, for example, in a game of Magic, like, I actually think there's probably an interesting and fun format to be had where you just get 20 mana floating in a pool at the start of every turn. You don't have any lands, and we just let you figure out what's the most degenerate thing you can do with this. Obviously, there are some cards that cannot be legal in this format. Tendrils of Agony, despite my personal affinity for Storm cards, likely not a card that you're allowed to play in a format where everyone gets mana for free. But I think you can start to understand why people find that fun and why it's engaging. Obviously, in the same way, although spending 50 mana worth of effects on one turn is quite interesting, there is also an element of layering your effects and learning when to leverage the resources that I think is particularly interesting in the Magic context. Ultimately, when you're talking about resource systems too, there are other elements at play here. I spent 50 mana worth of cards on that first turn, but I was mostly uninterrupted. I had a disruption for their one point of interaction, and then afterwards I just got to do what my full combo was with no other interruptions. But I actually did engage with Yu-Gi-Oh's resource system there, and had they had an Infinite Impermanence or an Effect Veiler or an Ash Blossom for my Lunalight Gold Leo, um, I would have lost the game because I used my normal summon, one of the big key resources in Yu-Gi-Oh, to play the Gold Leo, and if that hadn't worked, I wouldn't have been able to advance my board state at all, and my opponent would have won the game based on what their hand had in it. They definitely would have been able to assemble a winning hand, and I think that's something that I've noticed the more I've played Yu-Gi-Oh is that the idea that there are not resources is obviously completely untrue, but the way that the resources manifest, you start to see it more and more. The normal summon in Yu-Gi-Oh can be worth as much as like 45 mana. I think in some instances it can be worth more because of the way that it allows you to chain cards together. And in the same way, if your opponent has some kind of way to disrupt your normal summon, then you potentially lose access to all of that mana and all of those effects. So I think ultimately the results of this experiment are, I mean, mostly it was just fun for me to go make some comparisons for for Yu-Gi-Oh and Magic cards. I think that you really can't say one system is definitively way better than the other. It's just that they're very different, and they're very different in the way that they allow you to access resources. I think that, you know, increasingly we are seeing more and more resource systems that gear towards the Magic notion of incrementally giving you a set amount of resources every turn, and the interaction in the game is based on more numerically kind of evaluating how you can best interact with your opponent's resources. So like a good example of this is uh, in a lot of the kind of more recent TCGs that allow you to just either resource a card from hand every turn, or like in Riftbound where you just get runes every turn for free. It's just a part of the gameplay loop. Cards that are high tempo are typically much better because you're always hitting your resources. You're not having to choose between hitting land drops like you would be in Magic and getting the tempo cards. And the reason why the tempo cards are so good is because when everyone gets access to consistent resources, finding the most consistent ways to trade up on your resources becomes drastically much more important. I feel like I've gone on a little bit of a tangent here. I have Mabel. She's here to say hello. You could probably tell when she jumped on me mid conversation. But I don't know. I think that this was a cool experiment. I'd love to hear if you have other archetypes from Yu-Gi-Oh that you think would drastically exceed this number. I think that there are a ton that would, for what it's worth. I actually don't think 50 is anywhere close to the highest number you could get to if you wanted to do this kind of thought experiment with a different type of deck. Obviously, there are decks like Malice or like Junk Synchron that would likely get into the hundreds easily. But this is the best I could do. This was, well, not the best I could do, but this is the one that I decided to do. I thought it was pretty interesting. It was a lot of fun trying to figure out how to best template the effects from one game into another and evaluate the actual mana value. So I hope you enjoyed. If you made it all the way to the end of the video here, I hope you'll subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Say bye, Mabel.